The sight of a dog sitting in front of the Brazilian hospital shocked the doctors. Despite their efforts, they couldn't persuade the dog to leave. When they discovered why the dog was there, everyone was left speechless. The Santa Clara Hospital in the southern city of Ceará, Brazil, was typically bustling with activity. However, on a fateful Wednesday night in August 2019, the doctors and hospital staff were startled by an unusual commotion outside the emergency room. This surge in activity was not due to more patients. Instead, they were surprised to find a large number of dogs gathered outside the emergency unit. The staff couldn't understand why so many dogs had congregated there. It was a sight they had never witnessed before. 6 dogs, a mix of big and small, camped outside the hospital's emergency room, howling and whimpering as if they carried a secret message. They tried to get rid of the dogs, but they wouldn't budge, no matter how hard they tried. This behavior puzzled all the staff and left them confused. With a little digging, they found out that the dogs were connected to a recent ambulance arrival. The dogs had followed their owner to the hospital during an emergency. While it's common for pets to stay close to their owners during tough times, they usually wander off to find food or company. These dogs, however, were determined to stay at the hospital all day. It showed their loyalty, but the hospital couldn't let them stay there. The dogs were distracting and blocking the entrance, which was causing problems for paramedics, patients, and visitors. Unfortunately, they had to go, but this proved easier said than done. After several failed attempts at getting rid of the dogs, the hospital staff put their heads together to find a solution. It was then that someone suggested reaching out to Amigos de Patas Cianorte, a group of volunteers dedicated to animal welfare. With high hopes, the staff contacted the organization and invited them to lend a helping hand in understanding and managing this peculiar situation. Soon after, members of Amigos de Patas Cianorte arrived at the hospital, armed with blankets, dog treats, and a passion for caring for our 4-legged friends. The volunteers, seasoned in dealing with various animal scenarios, eagerly joined forces with the hospital staff to unravel the mystery of the steadfast dogs. With a little more investigation, they discovered that the dogs had followed a homeless man identified as Louise. Louise was somewhat of a legend in the streets. He had lived on the streets of Cianorte for 2 decades after he had been diagnosed with psychiatric problems and decided that he no longer wanted to live with his brothers. His family did everything to convince him to stay, but Louis had already made up his mind and moved out onto the streets. His brothers never gave up. They came from time to time to try and convince him to stay with them. But the man never budged. He maintained his stance that the streets were his home. Luis's brothers continued with their intermittent visits. They understood the challenges he faced on the streets, from the harsh weather to the unpredictability of life without a stable home. But each time they extended their invitation, he declined with a calm smile, insisting that the streets were where he belonged. True to his words, Luis was not alone and even had a family of his own. He had 6 dogs whom he fed and took care of to the best of his ability. Everyone knew about Luis and his 6 dogs, all of them identified as strays, living beings without a home who found comfort in each other's presence. Luis had started collecting dogs during his early days on the streets. He liked the company, but he mostly did it to make sure they didn't run into any danger. Whenever people gave him pocket change or food scraps, the dogs were his first thought. He would never part with any of them, and apparently, the feeling was mutual. The entire city knew about Luis and his dogs, and some people had even tried to get him off the streets with their own funds. Once, the volunteers at Amigos de Patas rented a house with a big yard for Luis and his dogs. They were excited to show him his new home, thinking he would be happy. They had chosen the house carefully and even built a kennel for the dogs. But when they got to the house, Luis surprised them by refusing to go inside. He said the street was his home, just like he had told his brothers before. The volunteers tried to explain how the house could keep him warm and safe, but Luis was sure he belonged on the street. The dogs, who had been put in their kennel, escaped and followed Luis, showing that they were always with him. On that Wednesday night, Luis had a stroke while he was on the street. Another homeless person saw what happened and called an ambulance. The paramedics quickly took Luis to the hospital. His dogs ran after the ambulance, barking all the way. When they got to the hospital, the dogs stayed by the emergency room entrance, waiting for Luis. As the paramedics took Luis into the hospital on a stretcher, his dogs barked and howled outside. The hospital staff quickly checked Luis's condition and started treating him urgently. Meanwhile, the dog stayed at the hospital entrance, listening intently. While Luis was inside, fighting for his life, his dog stayed outside, howling all night. When Amigos States came to the hospital, they knew they couldn't make the dogs leave. They came to support the dogs and the hospital staff. They gave food to the dogs and took photos of them watching over their owner. By morning, Luis was stable and ready to leave the hospital. His dogs had waited for him all night. When Luis and his brother left the hospital, the dogs were waiting at the front, unwilling to leave until they saw Luis. Luis didn't know about the dog's vigil and went on his way. But the dogs stayed, waiting for him to return. When the volunteers from Amigos Shana realized that Luis had left the hospital without knowing about the vigil for him, they felt sad for everyone involved. They wanted to reunite Luis with his dogs quickly. They knew it would be hard to get the dogs to leave the hospital without him. One volunteer went to Luis's brother's house to explain the situation and ask him to come back. Luis's brother understood how much Luis loved his dogs, so he helped bring him back to the hospital. When Luis returned, he wasn't surprised to see his dogs waiting for him. It was like he knew they would follow him. The reunion between Luis and his dogs was touching. The dogs were so happy to see him, wagging their tails with joy. Luis greeted each of them with a loving smile. When the dogs saw that Luis was okay, they decided it was time to leave the hospital. They followed him as he walked away, and everyone watching was amazed by their bond. After Luis left, the hospital courtyard, which had been noisy with the dogs barking, became quiet again. Luis agreed to take a bath and eat at his brother's house, which surprised his family. They thought he might accept their help because of his recent health scare. The news of Luis's willingness to enter a house and stay for a while spread through the community, sparking a mixture of surprise and hope. The hospital staff, who had witnessed the resilience of this man and the unwavering loyalty of his dogs, found themselves contemplating the possibility of a new beginning for him. Even the volunteers from Amigos de Patas Cianorte felt a sense of optimism. Everyone saw his acceptance as a sign that he might be ready to leave the streets after 20 years of living there and accept the offer of shelter. As Luis bathed and enjoyed a meal provided by his brother, the dogs too were not forgotten. They were fed and given water. At least for a fleeting moment, it seemed that the narrative of Luis's life might be on the verge of a significant shift. Meanwhile, the story of the dog's display at the hospital gained momentum when Simone Zilan, a volunteer from Amigos de Patas Cianorte, decided to share it in an interview with the Brazilian newspaper, G1. Simone's decision to speak about Luis and his dogs in an interview with G1 set in motion a series of events that would touch the hearts of people far beyond the streets of Cianorte. As her words and images found their way into the public domain, her statements and the heartfelt photographs she had taken of Luis's dogs outside the hospital struck a chord with the community and soon extended their reach beyond the town's borders. At first, the story was known mainly in Cianorte. People there, like hospital workers, volunteers, and residents, felt proud to see their community in a positive light. But the story spread online, reaching more people through blogs. As more people heard about Luis and his dogs, they were touched by the loyalty of the dogs. People from around the world admired this bond between humans and animals. Even though many hoped Luis would leave the streets, he and his dogs went back there. Only Luis knows why he chose to return to homelessness. Despite the global attention, Luis and his dogs stayed on the streets of Cianorte, unaware of how their story touched people worldwide. Life in Cianorte went on as usual, but the story of Luis and his loyal dogs left a lasting impression on those who knew it. What do you think of this story? Let us know in the comments section. I hope you liked this video. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones. Also subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss the update from our channel. Thank you.